By 2050, we'll have about, I think, close to 10 billion people. So to give you an indication of the amount of food that we'll need in the next 30 years, it's the same as the amount of food that we produced over the last 8,000 years. So that gives you an idea of the growth in productivity that we need.
Welcome back to Your Finance TV. As you may already know, food production is responsible for a significant portion of greenhouse gas emissions globally, with estimates ranging from 1/4 to 1/3 of all emissions. This includes emissions from deforestation and land use change, fertilizers and manure, methane from cattle and rice production, and energy use in food production and transportation. Given the urgent need to address climate change, it's critical that we find ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food production, while also ensuring sustainable and equitable access to food for all. We're going to sit down with Matthew Harrison from the University of Tasmania to explore some of the challenges and opportunities in achieving these goals. He's the lead author of the research report, Clarifying Confusions over Carbon Conclusions, which you can access at the links above or in the description below. Let's just go jump into this interview now. Hi, Matt, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation to speak to you today, Scott.
You're very welcome. All right, let's just jump straight into it, shall we? How do you think we can balance the need for sustainable food production with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, that will be one of the biggest challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, I think, because normally what happens is productivity is tightly coupled with greenhouse gas emissions. So if you increase productivity, for example, crop yields, your greenhouse gas emissions usually go up. And that's the same for any sector, really. So that's really a big challenge to decouple that growth in productivity with growth in emissions. So I work in agriculture, and by 2050, we'll have about, I think, close to 10 billion people. So to give you an indication of the amount of food that we'll need in the next 30 years, it's the same as the amount of food that we produced over the last 8,000 years. So we'll have to produce the same amount of food in the next 30 years as what we did in the last 8,000 years. So that gives you an idea of the growth in productivity that we need. And so the corresponding growth we'll probably have in greenhouse gas emissions is going to follow. So I think probably what we need is the development of skills, practices and technologies, and they need to be across the board. So they need to be in the agricultural sector, things like management, so improvement in crop sowing times, technologies, so machine learning and satellite imagery and that sort of thing, and skills really. So skills is a big one. So getting the necessary training and extension out there to the end users so that they adopt these new technologies and that they're aware of them, really. So it's really a big challenge, and it will be a concerted effort from research, development to extension and adoption.
Okay, then. So what role do you think irrigated systems can play in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions through soil organic carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so irrigated systems globally, they don't account for a very large land use area. So I think it's about 18% of global land use, of global agricultural land use, that is irrigated. So it's quite small. And that's because water and the necessary infrastructure is limited associated with that. So at the global scale, irrigated landscapes are quite small, but the ability of those irrigated croplands or pasture lands to sequester soil carbon is disproportionate. And that's because you can grow stuff. So the more you water, you can alleviate water stress. And so what happens above ground usually corresponds to what happens below ground when we're talking about soil organic carbon. So if you can improve productivity, which you can with irrigation, you can alleviate water stress when it occurs, then in general you can maintain and improve soil carbon. So if you get something like a drought, and that knocks back above ground productivity, grass growth or crop growth, for example, generally what happens is that you lose organic matter and soil organic carbon after that. So that's through things like increased soil temperature, increased soil respiration. So the CO2, carbon dioxide that was sequestered is lost again, is lost in it more, losses are bigger than what they are in terms of sequestration. Whereas irrigation, you can avoid that water stress, and so you can basically keep that organic matter maintained in the soil and improved, really. So overall, I think irrigation has a big role to play, and particularly management of irrigated croplands and pasture lands, I think, is a large part of it as well.
Okay. How can we reduce the use of nitrogenous fertilizers in intensified agricultural practices while still maintaining high crop yields?
Yeah, well, nitrogenous fertilizers, they were discovered, I think, in the Green Revolution, I think probably the 1970s, and they, as I say, they result in something called the Green Revolution when food production went through the roof. So nitrogenous fertilizers is a bit like sugar to a human. Um, Plants absolutely love it, sort of thing. The problem is with excessive use of nitrogenous fertilizers, you get losses. And one way you can get that loss is through nitrous oxide emissions, which is basically a gas. Another one is ammonia, which is also a gas. Both of those are greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide in particular. So if you apply nitrogen and it's not all used by the plant, you can get losses in terms of gaseous losses, but also nitrogen leaching. So if you want to reduce the amount of nitrogen that you use, but still maintain plant growth and yield and food production, which we do, it comes down to how much nitrogen do you apply. It's a bit like sugar with a human. How much do you eat at once? And when do you apply it? So what times relative to the growing season? So typically for cropping, farmers might apply all nitrogen up front at sowing. One way to get around that might be to apply nitrogen over the course of the growing season. So as the crop dry matter accumulates, as growth occurs, you put more nitrogen on so that it uses that nitrogen as it's applied. Another way is the form of nitrogen. So there's things like green urea, which reduces the rate of, it's like a little granule in the soil, and that dissolves effectively. Green urea slows down that dissolution in the soil. So it slows down and the plant can use it more effectively. Nitrogen is very volatile. It can be easily lost, sort of thing. So they're wanting to slow that down. So there's things like the right timing, the right place, the right rate. You can actually reduce the amount of nitrogen applied and maintain or even improve productivity. So that's called improving nitrogen use efficiency.
Okay. And how important is considering initial soil organic carbon stocks and their influence on long-term trajectories of soil carbon accrual when implementing sustainable farming practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that we've showed in a recent publication in Global Environmental Change Advances that initial soil carbon stocks and indeed initial soil organic matter is more important than we first thought. So soil organic carbon can't increase forever. They can only increase to a point, and that point in the soil is about 5 or 6 or 7%. Above that, soil organic carbon accrual or accumulation doesn't really increase that much. So if you're starting off from a high base up near 5 or 6 or 7%, and then you're saying, well, I'm going to change a practice, for example, install irrigation or apply more nitrogen to improve soil organic carbon, well, your prospects of improving soil organic carbon are pretty low if you're up near the top. Whereas if you start near the bottom, a low soil organic carbon, which might be 0.5% or 1%, then you make some practice change, like applying nitrogen or crop type or sowing time, your prospects for improving soil organic carbon over the next 10 or 20 years, provided you maintain that practice change, are probably quite high. So you get up to a point, it's called an asymptote or a plateau. You get up to a point, then soil organic carbon accumulation will slow. It's a bit like planting trees. So they grow fast at the start and then they get up to mature size and then their growth slows right down. So the same concept applies to soil organic carbon.
Okay. And what are some challenges you see in implementing sustainable farming practices and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, well, I lead a lot of transdisciplinary research, and really I think we need everything from the research and development, so the basic fundamental research to discover the new technologies in the laboratory or in the field, in testing, in extension, and also in adoption. So, for example, there's a lot of prospective technologies and practices out there already that are not necessarily widely known or comprehensively adopted. That's because people just don't know about them. So there's a big role for extension to play in education, in workshops, in webinars, in that sort of thing to make people, farmers and industry aware of these new technologies and practices. There is also a big role for research and development though, so to discover these new prospective ideas, for example. So part of it is in looking holistically at systems rather than looking at it in a reductionist way. So, for example, one paddock or one field or one component of a system, look at the whole system. So not just an individual paddock, but the whole farm and indeed the whole value chain. So greenhouse gas emissions are a very complex thing, and really we do need to reduce them to mitigate the extent of global warming, but we're going to have to maintain or improve food security or food production in future as well. So it's improving food production while reducing greenhouse gas emissions is going to be a very delicate balance, but I think we probably can do it, just as we've risen to previous challenges in the past. For example, reducing CFCs in the atmosphere to reduce the ozone depletion, which we did do. We could do the same with carbon if we just keep working on it and keep focused on the key goals.
Listen, Matthew, thank you so much for your time today. It's a great report that you've published, and everyone should really be clicking into it. We look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you, Scott.
On today's show, we've discussed some of the key challenges and opportunities in sustainable food production and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's clear that there are no easy solutions to these complex issues, but there are many promising strategies and technologies that can help us move towards a more sustainable and equitable food system. From soil carbon sequestration to regenerative agriculture, from plant-based diets to reducing food waste, there are many ways that we can make a positive impact on the environment and human health. It's up to all of us, from farmers and policymakers to consumers and businesses, to work together towards a more sustainable future. Thank you for joining us for this show and a very important conversation.